Hey guys, welcome back. Chris here with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV. Today we have another tabletop review and comparison for you. Today we're going to be taking a look at the FG42. Now this is going to be somewhat of a two-part video. First, we're going to look at the developmental history of the FG42 rifle, as well as I'm going to talk more in depth about specifically the two rifles here on the table. So if that sounds interesting to you, please stick around. That's coming up now. Alright guys, jumping into this. First, again, we're going to talk about the history of this rifle. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be discussing is going to come from this book. This is sort of highly regarded as a primary source of information if you're looking for really good in-depth information on the FG42 rifle. This is called Death from Above, the German FG42 paratrooper rifle, written by Thomas B. Dugalby and Blake Stevens. So again, a lot of the information is going to be credited to this book. Pick it up if you want more information. There's also translated German field manuals in here from both rifles. Really cool source of information. So I wanted to point that out first. Alright guys, the history of the FG42 would actually begin in 1941 out of necessity brought on by the disastrous attack of the Greek island of Crete during Operation Mercure. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now this attack was actually done in two waves. First, the gliders came in, followed up by the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers. Now paratrooper doctrine at the time in Germany was such that the paratroopers would drop with small arms. These would be handguns, hand grenades, small compact submachine guns, and all of their heavy support weapons, or K98s, MG34s, and such, would actually be put in weapons crates and dropped separately. This was to make it easier for the paratroopers to drop, not getting equipment tangled up and things like that, people being injured upon, touching down on the ground and things like that, carrying large, 32-pound MG34s and whatnot. So in philosophy, this was a good idea, but in practice, it was actually pretty bad. Now, the island of Crete was actually very heavily defended by New Zealand and British troops. They were tipped off that an invasion was coming, and they were fully prepared. They had a lot of anti-air set up. So when the Fallschirmjäger came in, they were dropped very low at about 400 feet and scattered over about a 300-meter distance. Now, what this led to is the different, elements of the Fallschirmjäger being dropped and scattered over a very wide area. And of course, since the weapons crates are carrying weapons for multiple troops who are dropped all over the place, and most of them are left pretty heavily unarmed against a very fortified and well-defended enemy. So the operation was a huge disaster, needless to say. Now, the island would eventually be taken over, but there was a huge loss of life and equipment on the German side, much more than would be necessary had they been fully prepared for the invasion and had the Fallschirmjäger drop gone a little bit better according to plan. Now, when this news would come back to Hitler, of course, there's a couple things we know about Hitler. One is he hates to lose. He hates, operations going poorly, and this would be actually one of the first, at the time, really big military failures that the Germans had encountered. Now, Hitler would point the finger at the Fallschirmjäger. He would say, this whole idea of sort of the mechanized aerial paratrooper combat force is too new, it's too different, and it's a concept that hasn't really been proven. In fact, our first wide-scale attack with the Fallschirmjäger has been a huge disaster, so let's get them out of the Luftwaffe and not waste any more time with this silly idea of paratrooping, soldiers. Hitler was also very much a traditionalist. He himself had served in the First World War. He was a huge believer of the military equipment that was used in that war and the military tactics, very much a ground force type of approach towards things. Now, funny enough, simultaneously on the offset of the lukewarm, successful invasion of Crete, Senior Air Secretary Ossenbach would receive an order from the German War Department requesting development of a new rifle that would be used exclusively by the Luftwaffe, specifically for the Fallschirmjäger troops. Now, development of this rifle would come with a list of requirements, and this would be known as the LC6 program and would later lead into this rifle. So let's go ahead and talk about this. Now, the requirements for this new weapons program would be as follows, and this comes out of page 4 of Death from Above. Number 1, not to exceed 1 meter in length, not to be heavier than a standard K98K rifle. The caliber is to be in 7.92 by 57 millimeter. That's the standard 8 millimeter service cartridge. To have a detachable magazine with a minimum of a 10-round capacity. To have a select fire capability, firing in semi-automatic from a closed bolt and fully automatic from an open bolt. To be free from stoppages. To have a 1.5 power telescopic sight, to be equipped with a grenade launcher, to be equipped with a bayonet, To be capable of being used as a club in close combat situations. To have no necessity for a removable barrel. The barrel must have a life of 2,000 rounds. To be provided with a collapsible grip for the left hand so that the weapon will not intertangle with clothing or equipment. To be provided with a folding bipod for firing in the prone position. The butt to be designed to absorb recoil. The weapon must be stable and not jump around when firing. Protection to be provided against dirt entering the mechanism. The weapon must not be sensitive to shocks and drops when in use. Now, coming out of this list of requirements, two companies would come out with pre-production prototypes. They were Rheinmetall and Krieghoff. Now, both will come out with what was known as their Type A variations, but it was found through testing that the Rheinmetall version showed more promise and looked really a lot like this one here. This one comes a little bit later and we'll explain that. What they went with essentially was a fully stamped sheet metal construction. So stamped receiver, stamped buttstock, stamped metal handguard, stamped bipod, but which was actually mounted up to the front of the barrel. And when it came to the operating system, they looked abroad at their foreign contemporaries and found the success of the Lewis gun used by the British in the Second World War to show a lot of promise as being implemented in this design as well. Now, the Lewis gun used the rack and pinion type of operating system. It had an operating rod with teeth that interface with a clock type recoil spring housed here underneath the forward portion of the machine gun. I'm talking about the Lewis gun here. It had an independent camming bolt, and the firing pin was mounted to the operating rod. Actually, similar designs were used later on things like the M60, so it was actually, for the time of production, was a very novel type of operating system. So Rheinmetall would go with that sort of operating system approach in the FG42 rifle, and that would actually stay in service with all variations of the FG42 through the end of the war. Now, instead of the sort of clock spring contraption that was a little bit weird and finicky, they just went with the traditional recoil spring, later adding in sort of buffer type of construction to the rear of the gun, and I'll talk about that as well. Now, keep in mind, the whole purpose of this is to scale down inventory of the Luftwaffe. It was a problem to be able to jump with 35-pound MG34s and long K98K rifles, which is why they went with the whole weapons crate approach in the first place. The idea here is can we get rid of all weapons in inventory, replacing it with one do-everything type rifle. So also with that, there is the necessity for sustained support fire, which is why you have an 8mm Mauser cartridge feeding in from an detachable box magazine with the bipod, so it can serve in a support role if it needs to. Now, it's difficult to get lightweight, light material into a long, heavy firepower, sort of sustained firepower type of weapon. So that would be something that they would try and tackle as well as they would move on down the road. Now, the Type B, which they would move into, would have subtle changes. They would move from the sheet metal handguard to an impregnated type resin type of synthetic material handguard. Main reason being is the stamped sheet metal had a tendency to heat up quickly, also keeping production costs and time into account. And they would move the bipod from attaching at the front to now attaching at the back, which we see here. So the pivot point of the bipod is now moved to the back. Now again, as mentioned, they are sort of wrestling with this idea of how can we get long-term sustained fire out of such a lightweight package built on stamped metal. Now there was a prominent arms designer working at Rheinmetall at the same time known as Louis Stange, and he had been looking at the FG42 and coming up with design improvements on his own, and he is actually credited as really coming up with this design entirely. Now one of the main differences he was looking at was instead of stamped metal, we need to go to a milled, machined receiver. It needs to be more durable and more robust if it's going to meet the firepower requirements of the LC6 program. So Rheinmetall would actually move forward with a new variation that was derived by Louis Stange, and that was known as the Type C. Now the Type C would actually be the first variation that they would produce actually in few numbers, something between 20 and 50 were manufactured for extensive testing. Now these would go off to the German War Department and actually all be tested to destruction, and it was found to be a very promising design. So the Type C is our first one. We're starting to really look a lot like this, milled receiver but stamped sheet metal stock, and all other early features are the same. So feeding from the left-hand side, chambered in 8mm Mauser. Now at the time they had thought, okay, well, do we want to move to something in a more intermediate cartridge? There's two reasons why they did not, and they stuck with 8mm. Number one is, first, as mentioned, Hitler wanted to separate the Fallschirmjäger from the Luftwaffe and actually wanted to can the project altogether. What they thought then is they could keep the Fallschirmjäger as a N10 intact sort of tactical fighting force. However, it had to be then largely supplied by the Wehrmacht. So the philosophy here is we'll drop troops with this and maybe a couple magazines worth of ammunition. Once they touch ground, they will then join forces with the Wehrmacht, and the Wehrmacht will be supplying them with their ammunition on the ground. So it needed to have the standard 8mm cartridge that was being used by the Wehrmacht in the K98 and MG34 rifles. The second reason is really their only military action that the Fallschirmjäger had really been involved in was Crete, and it was found that the British troops with their .303 rounds were able to outshoot German forces, especially when they were stuck to using things like submachine guns and pistols and 9mm. So they realized that, okay, in our modern combat type of operations, we need to have a cartridge that is capable of outperforming British and later American cartridges, the full-powered rifle cartridges. Therefore, the rifle must be in a full-powered rifle cartridge. Now, after testing had concluded of the original series of Type C rifles, a bunch of data came back from those reports. They reinforced the small parts that wore out easily and quickly, small springs, small parts, things like that. And they made a variation of 50 additional Type C rifles. Now, they actually took a pretty interesting approach. In the new production run of 50 rifles that were going to be used for testing, they made subtle variations in all 50 rifles. That would be the way that the buttstocks were formed, the finish that was used, whether it was like a black enamel paint or a bluing, different sight configurations. So there were different variations of the rear sight using multiple different apertures, this one using a rotary type system, which actually is what they landed on. We'll talk about that. The placement of the bipod, the configuration of the muzzle device. There was a 2-piece and a 1-piece muzzle brake that was tested with. So all 50 variations were had subtle changes. So when all 50 went out to testing and evaluation, they could see the success rate of different types of finish or parts or sights or bipods, and then incorporate all the successful ones into a final production type model. It was actually a very interesting approach. Now, gun number 15 actually showed to be the most promising, and it would have the production type qualities that they would later move on to. It had a 2-piece stamped sheet metal buttstock that would be welded together, a 2-piece fire control grip with a swept back handle that was also welded together. It used a single reticle type or a single aperture type rear sight that was adjusted by a simple rotary drum on the back. Pretty cool feature. Bipod attached to the rear here, and a single piece muzzle brake. So those would be all of the design elements that they would move forward with. Now, one interesting stroke of genius at Rheinmetall. Now, as mentioned, Hitler, everybody knows that they would need Hitler's blessing to continue on with full production of this rifle. So Rheinmetall actually gifted one of these 50 rifles to Hermann Goring, who was in control of the Luftwaffe at the time and also a prominent player in Hitler's inner circle. They knew that if they could get Hermann Goring excited about this rifle, it would mean a lot more to Hitler having Goring talk to him about this than Rheinmetall or the German War Department or anybody else. So actually in Christmas of 1942, they would gift this rifle to one of the 50 production rifles to Hermann Goring. He would use it and actually not only see that there was a tremendous amount of promise in the weapon design in general, but also Hermann Goring had a huge financial stake in Krieghoff, a big manufacturing conglomerate of small arms. And although Krieghoff did put forward their design early on and it was sort of shrugged off, Hermann Goring saw, okay, if we can get approval for this production model, I will award production rights to Krieghoff. They can manufacture all of them, and I can get benefits from it as sort of having a financial stake in the company. So moving forward, as predicted, Hermann Goring would go to Hitler with this rifle. They would test it, and actually Hitler would fall in love with it. This very similar sort of history with the MP43 and MP44 rifles later on. Hitler would actually be the one to christen this, the FG42, and FG for Fallschirmjägergewehr, paratrooper's rifle, 42 being adopted or being accepted in the year 1942. He would say, okay, move forward with full-scale production of this, and he even went on to say that if this gets further developed, this will be the new rifle in all branches of the German military. The Wehrmacht will even be using the FG42. So, Hitler, of course, took a 180 on his approach to this rifle, and the project was greenlit. With the new order to move forward, they would take everything they learned from the Type C. Again, remember, they took everything from gun number 15. They incorporated all the beneficial features, the single reticle rotary sight, the bipod placement, the construction, and how everything was going to be fit and formed together. And they would come out with a Type D, which would all represent sort of like number 15 from the Type C program. Now, one interesting feature that I mentioned was here on the backward swept hand grip. Now, there's been a lot of debate over why they went with this design. Some people have said it gives you the traditional ergonomics of a rifle, but I think it actually comes out of necessity for the folding pistol grip. This is just my assumption. So one of the requirements early on was that the pistol grip actually had to fold, so it could be folded back and out of the way while jumping. Now, adding different hinge mechanisms and springs and different things like that is going to add further complexity to the design and manufacture of the firearm. Furthermore, those parts can break, and if your pistol grip is broken in the rearward position and you can't unlock it and move it, that would make it very difficult to use. So my guess is that they compromised and went with a swept back design that would be more out of the way and easier to jump with, while having to avoid putting in a sort of rotary type or a folding or collapsing pistol grip in general. So that's why I believe they went with this design, but that's just my opinion. So by July of 1943, the Type D is manufactured in limited numbers and goes on to further testing. When final testing on the Type D was concluded, there would be a couple more notes, a couple more subtle changes made to the design, mainly strengthening up different elements of the gun, and it was greenlit for a final production model known as the Type E, and that is what we have here. This was the Type E, the first FG42 that was actually scaled for production or greenlit for actual full-scale production. Now, as predicted, Hermann Goring would award production rights to Krieghoff, and they would be given a contract of 5,000 units. Now, when these would start to be produced, they were actually a lot more crude than the Type D. Remember, the earlier prototype versions were made in very small runs. They were made to the best of manufacturing ability to try and improve the concept, but these are now production guns, and more costs are saved and more corners are cut. So the welds holding together the two-piece buttstock and pistol grip were very crude. The finish was now moved to sort of like a black paint on most of the parts. You still have the milled receiver that Louis Stange had really improved upon and designed for this production model, but all other elements are just like the one you see here. Now, Type D stocks were used in early production of the new Type E rifle, and later a improved Type E stock would be implemented. Now, this one has the Type E stock, and you can tell by the reinforcing ribs that are added to it. The Type D was just sort of a flat pressed stamped metal stock. So again, this is the later Type E found on this example. Now, of the 5,000 units that Krieghoff was slated for production of, only 2,000 would be produced by the time that Germany realized it really needed to simplify production of all of its weapons, and then that would lead us into the beginning stages of the Type G and F FG42. So by about the fall of 1943, Germany is starting to experience a lot of complications in their war effort. They're starting to see a lot of pushback on the Eastern Front. They're starting to see a lot of military failure, and there is a growing need for more war material, a shortening of resources, and they need more weapons specifically out in the hands of their troops. And spending time with more complicated designs like this is starting to fall by the wayside. So Krieghoff would actually cease production on the Type E FG42 around this time, having only produced about 2,000 of the 5,000 units that they were slated to produce. Now, at that same time, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had actually put out a cease and desist, if you will, on different weapons programs that were happening at the same time. Now, you had the MKB-42, the MP-43, later the MP-44, the Sturmgewehr rifles that would come out. They would put a cease order on the production of those. They would put a cease order on the MG-15 and MG-17 machine guns that were slightly antiquated technology, mainly used for aircraft purposes anyway, and they would put a cease order on the FG-42. Now, like a lot of companies, they like to skirt around these types of restrictions, again, because they have financial interests in producing these firearms that they are being contracted to produce. In fact, all the material, the research, R&D has already been done, so they would like to keep making these firearms. So what they would actually do is start changing the nomenclature and start changing the production approaches of these firearms. Now, in terms of the MKB-42 and the MP-43, they would just rename it the MP-43 and continue on with production. After all, the order did say stop production on the MKB-42 and MP-43, so they said, fine, we will. We'll now make the MP-43 instead. On the FG42, they would take a similar approach. So they would go through a complete redesign of the firearm. Most importantly, what they would use is actually stamped sheet metal pressings as the receiver section. Now, by 1943, remember the MG42 and elements of the MP40 had actually been in wide-scale mass production for quite some time. with the type of material that was being used to manufacture those, as well as a better understanding of improved manufacturing processes of stamped metal firearms, it was found that we can take a lot of what we learned from the MG42 program and incorporate it into the FG42, keeping up with the reinforced elements. Again, the MG42 is a machine gun that's built on very heavy sustained fire, so why not incorporate a lot of design elements from that and those manufacturing techniques into the new FG42 rifle? Along with that would come other cost-saving elements. You're getting away from the stamped sheet metal stock and going into a laminated wood. So this is laminated beech wood used on what was now the pre-production Type G FG42, which is the first one to look like this. And you have laminated wood here in the back. Now this again is taken out of design simplifications from the K98 production. So the K98s were typically made from fine walnut stocks. Later on, due to the same limited or the same lack of resources, K98 stocks would start to be made with laminated wood. So they would use that same cost-saving technology here on the wood of the FG42. Handguards also being made from either walnut or solid wood or laminated wood as well. Now down here on the pistol grip, they would get away from the larger two-piece stamped metal housing, which incorporated the entirety of the pistol grip. They would create these shorter blanks that required about half as much material, and then rivet on a two-piece sort of Bakelite or plastic hand grip and the sort of traditional vertical configuration. They would move the bipod from the rear, which was found on the Type E, to the front, giving it more support, again, more commonly found on their machine guns. They would redesign a simplified muzzle brake, which was actually incredibly effective. But they would keep the crucial design elements, the side-fed 8mm loaded 20-round capacity magazines, and the Lewis gun type operating system in here, and you have the same buffer type system here, so the buttstock does absorb a lot of that recoil as well. So the early prototypes of the Type G, this rifle was known as the Type F. It was their first proof of concept, but there was not a lot of really design or elemental changes between the F and the G. The G was the model that they would actually put into full-scale production. Now again, Krieghoff would maintain their primary contract rights for this rifle. Now Krieghoff's production code was FZS, and out of all FG42s of all types produced, Krieghoff would manufacture about 95% of them. Now a couple subcontractors are actually brought in for production of the FG42 Type G. Those were L.O. Dietrich, which had a production code of GCY, and I.C. Wagner Mulhausen, which had a production code of GAL. Now, L.O. Dietrich only produced about 400 before the end of the war, and I.C. Wagner Mulhausen actually never got production up before they were overrun by the Allies. If we look at total production of the FG42, about 8,500 units would be produced. That's Type A through Type G. If we look at A through E, the original variation, about 2,200 were manufactured. And if we look at the F and the G, about 4,300 would be produced, which makes both types of the FG42 exceedingly rare, especially here on the U.S. consumer market currently today, which will lead me into the two rifles that we actually have here in this video, what they are, and the sort of design elements that they encompass. So let's talk specifically about what it is I have here on the table. So as mentioned, very few of these were actually manufactured in Germany during the war, and even fewer of them have actually made it here to the United States. As they are select fire or transferable machine guns, very few are actually on the registry. Probably a dozen or less of each actually exist here, and when they do show up for sale, they routinely command a price of about $250,000 or higher dollars on the open market. As such, there has been a demand for these, and there is a company that stepped up to fill that demand, and that is known as SMG, Smith Machine Group, out of Decatur, Texas. Now, SMG is run by Rick Smith and his son. To my knowledge, they are the only two in the company that are working on final production of these rifles. I'm sure they may have some shop help, and I'm sure they subcontract some of their parts and finishing processes, but by and large, it is the two of them putting these things together, to my knowledge, and it is a very small operation. Now, about 10 or 12 years ago, I don't know the exact date, Rick would come out with the Type 2, that's how they know it for their nomenclature, the Type 1 and the Type 2, or the Type E and the Type F, or the Type G, FG42 rifles. Now, his Type 2 was the first one that he would produce, and he's produced probably a few thousand of these since then. Now, A couple years ago, he would come out with the Type E or the Type 1, and that was this one here. And when this one came to the market, I was specifically interested in this one. These are both my rifles. So I ordered one and I got it, and I loved it so much, and the workmanship and the quality, that I went ahead and ordered a second one. Now, because they have very limited production capacity, these do take quite a long time for them to build, so they do build them in certain different production runs, and you can get your name on a list. It's a waiting list, a $100 deposit, and it took me a year of waiting for this one. It took me actually just shy of 2 years waiting on this one, but COVID had a lot to do with that one. But the wait is very well worth the product. Now, they are not cheap, as there's a lot of R&D that went into these rifles. At the time that I got this one, I think I was between about $5,000 and $6,000, but the pricing did go up again because of supply issues brought on by COVID. So this one was around the $6,000 to $7,000 mark. So they are not inexpensive, but if you're comparing them to a real transferable World War II FG42, $5,000 or $6,000 pales in comparison to $250,000, which I will probably never have to spend on a firearm. If I had that money, I wouldn't. I'm more than happy with these. They are really good facsimiles and representations. Now, we talked about the production that had gone into the Type 1 or the Type E, and everything about this is very spot on in terms of looking at pictures and things like that. I've never held a real one. This has the Type E reinforced rib stock. The bipod they took certain liberties with, so it does fold open and lock here in the middle position. Now, in the original FG42, there was no locking device, so the legs could just sort of flop around. Here, Rick has put in a latching system, so you can actually reach in underneath the handguard and push on that to release it, but it stays locked in place. So he's added certain design elements that just make sense on the design. I believe if you want to, you can have them leave those latches out. I believe that's an option. So basically what he sends you is a build sheet, if you will, with like 15 or 20 different options that you can pick from, everything down to the finish type and things like, do you want a rear adjustable sight, more modern features? Do you want it? He makes them at 8mm Mauser and 308, so depending on the caliber you want. I went with a Bakelite finish because the originals were sort of painted, so it kind of gives it that painted look. He can do them in blued as well, and he does do sort of an enamel paint type finish as well, but that can chip and things over time, so I just went with the Cerakote. Did I say Cerakote? I think it's a Bakelite. It was Cerakote is what I meant to say. Put a Cerakote finish on this. It sort of gives it that look, but really protects it for longevity. You can go with the sort of darker handguards or the lighter handguards. Now, earlier production ones would have actually had more of a lighter finish on it, but over time, you see them today, they're very dark. A lot of that is just due to aging of the firearm. So, being used over the last decades kind of darkens it out. So I went with the darker one on this and a lighter one on this. It has the correct, one-piece muzzle brake found on the Type E. It uses the exact same operating system. Of course, it's been sent for a closed bolt semi-automatic only due to, we can't have, fully automatic rifles unless you want to do a post sample, which I think they do as well for certain people, but don't quote me on that. And it uses ZB26 magazines. Original FG42 magazines are ridiculously expensive, like $5,000 to $10,000 a piece if you can find them, and it's hard to find them separate from a gun. So these are modified ZB26 magazines, and when you buy one, it comes with two that are fit to the gun. You can put your own production code. I went with FZS since they were all made by Krieghoff anyway. Serial number on mine is number 37. So I got this sort of early on with the FG42 roll markings. They have, sort of these weren't Waffen amped because they were not used by the Wehrmacht, but you have the Air Force markings on them as well. A very, very cool detail. Early production ones would use split pins. Like the MG42 and MG34. Later, they would go to a single pin with a retaining spring, so that feature is found here as well, which was correct for the Type E. So very just excellent facsimile here. Now, this uses a Moss 36 bayonet. The original FG42 bayonets were very much modeled after the Moss bayonet, so it's close enough and looks the part. He does not include these with the gun, so you would have to source one on your own and send it in. And he will, modify it and install it for free, but does not supply it as part of the original package. So there is that. Now, when it comes to the Type 2, again, you have different options of what you want. Now, one design sort of change that he had made is, again, remember the Type F and Gs were were stamped. They were stamped metal. These are milled. So for production reasons, he went with a milled receiver. That's totally fine. But he put in like little rivet. This is actually new design features that he put on the newer receivers, like little rivet heads and things like that, that give it that sort of look, which is kind of a cool detail element that he's just added to his now produced Type 2 FG42s. So there's that. It has a shell deflector on it, which was found on the original. The plastic grips, they were both made in black and brown, so those are both options that he offers. You can do solid walnut or laminate, so I went with the laminate on the stock and the solid walnut on the handguard. And then different finishing elements. Do you want certain parts of blued, certain parts parkerized? Well, parkerizing was a lot of what they used on the Type 2s. So I went with a lot of parkerized elements on the the muzzle brake and the bipod yoke and the front sight base and the gas block, the charging handle, and then I went with sort of in the white, if you will, sort of browned out bolt on that, which is a new option he offers as well. But these are just, I mean, I can't tell you enough just how gorgeous these are. These representations are just very, very well done. Just beautiful rifles, and they are just very well thought out and very true to the original design. So I'm just very happy to have these in, and I wanted to take a moment in this video to sort of point this out, because it is an option that we have to get FG42s here locally on the consumer market. Again, not super cheap, but way cheaper than $250,000 machine gun. So anyway, guys, that is where I'm going to leave it with this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions down below. And if you enjoy our content, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you are aware when we are posting new videos. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.